I want to influence a paradigm shift and think about the East as something very positive and the natural state of, let's say, success of Sephardic and Eastern Jewry. And when the West it complements the East. I'm not going to only talk positively about the East. You'll see there are negative things too. And of course, I'm not only going to talk about the long-range negative effects of the West. The West is a reality, but many of you also are a combination of all sorts of origins and cultures. And I think the paradigm shift is very important, and it enriches the Jewish people, and it enriches our view of what Sephardic Jewry is, and of course what Eastern Jewry is from the Arab and Muslim world. Okay, go on. So, what's the East? Obviously, Jews from Babylonia, medieval Spain, Ottoman Empire, North Africa, Yemen. And the West, you could say the headlines would be confrontation with Catholicism in Iberia and Christian minorities in the Ottoman Empire, blood libels, etc., etc., tensions. The Jews always were favorable to the sovereign, so they clashed with modern European nationalism, especially in the Balkans. The Jews were advanced by Westernization in the Ottoman Empire, but in the end that led to secularization. Europeanization obviously led to learning foreign languages, and the Jews modernized their cities, but all that was temporary. I mean, in the big picture, the Holocaust wiped out most of this, or assimilation in the West, or the melting pot in Israel. But I want to sort of focus on a little bit the Eastern nature of the Jews in Spain and in the Ottoman Empire. Next. So, scholars talk about the convivencia, that the Jews live together with the Muslims and the Christians, primarily the Jews and the Muslims. It's basically from the 9th, 10th century in Spain till the 12th century. But that was temporary. And maybe relations were decent between Jews and Muslims in Spain itself on a local level, but in time the regimes led to the decay of Jewish life, the Muslim regimes, but they were the strength of the Jews earlier, in the 10th to the 12th century, and you had political leaders like Chasdai ibn Chaprut, the vizier like the prime minister, Samuel or Shmuel ibn Nagrela, and moving on. So we think kind of dogmatically about Hellenism. Hellenism ruined the Second Temple. Hellenism is paganism, but Greek philosophy was part of our strength, and we attained that through living in a rich Muslim society. And the Rambam, for example, based himself on Aristotelian thought, and other rabbis, Sephardic rabbis, did also. In the 19th century, you have a rejection of that, but again, it was our strength. So the Rambam wrote the Moreh Nevuchim, the Guide for the Perplexed, in Judeo-Arabic, and also in his book on logic, he talks about the necessities of understanding Aristotelian philosophy, and obviously the great thinkers like Averroes, Aquinas, etc., etc. And the Jews, the medieval I would say, culturally rich Jew from Spain under Islamic Spain was influenced by all sorts of patterns of thought in philosophy, in astronomy, in medicine. They were influenced by Al-Farabi, who was actually in Persia. But it's one whole big civilization. You can't think about it in terms of today, in terms of nationalism. Iran over there in the east, and Spain over there in the west. And Spain and Iberia, less Portugal, is definitely the east in thought. It's the west geographically, but the whole paradigm shift is that the main lingua franca, the main language was Judeo-Arabic. It wasn't Spanish as we think of it today. Later on, when the Jews were expelled and went to the Ottoman Empire, then they developed the Judeo-Spanish, Castilian Spanish in Hebrew writing and Rashi characters, but it isn't a question of Spain as we know Spain or we envision Spain. It was a certain Muslim Spain which laid the base, and of course the clash was when Christianity and Catholicism had the upper hand and then conquered all of Iberia, and then the Jews were in trouble. Go on. So I talked about how the Jews in medieval Spain benefited from philosophical rationalist thinking. And this is very different than Ashkenazi thinking, classical rabbinic Eastern European thinking. And it led to the Jews being talented in all these facilities and all these disciplines, but also, of course, the Greek thought and the Islamic thought also led to a proliferation in Jewish thought and in Hebrew and Judeo-Arabic poetry, balladry, music, and folk tradition. So if you look at the base of Ibn Ezra, that is classical, medieval Islamic thought with a lot of, say, tenets of Judaism in it. Go on. So we all know about the poets, Ibn Giro, Yehuda Halevi, Samuel Ibn Nagrela, and then there's the famous quote that this, I think, is very pertinent to the lecture. Yehuda Halevi says, "My heart is in the east, and I am in the depths of the west." And that, in today's terms, it typifies where Judaism and where the Jewish people are. But we've been strayed, let's say, from our roots, from our Eastern roots, and the whole, I think, part of the current Renaissance, and whatever that means, in terms of Sephardic cognizance and learning about the Jews of the East, is that our richness is in the East, and no matter where we are, it can be part of it. And to delineate it is really an aberration of Jewish tradition. Run. So, you had Rambam. Rambam wrote in Judeo-Arabic. He wrote Moreh Nevuchim in Judeo-Arabic. He wrote his book on logic in Judeo-Arabic. And then you had the Ramban, who's famous, and I don't have to talk about him. And Ibn Ezra, and there were many more. I just put in these brief names because they're the front row medieval Jewish thinkers. And going on. But then, after the 12th century, the Muslim rulers limited Jewish freedom, persecuted the Jews, and when the Catholics are gaining ground in Iberia, that's essentially the beginning of the end for the Jews. There were the 1391 riots, there were tens of thousands of deaths, 200,000 Jews were forced to convert, and then Judaism weakened greatly. Already at this point, Jews fled to places like Sicily, a little bit the Ottoman Empire. And in the 15th century, the problem of new Christians. All these Jews that had to convert or converted were looked upon by the Catholic Church as not being devout. And so it was thought that the Inquisition was formed so that new Christians could be put in line. But there are actually Jews already in the, let's say, 1480s were brought to the Inquisition, even though they weren't Catholic. But most of the Inquisition is a phenomenon for believing Catholics, or it's a power game from the church and the monarchy, and you've heard of all sorts of horrors. But this is part of not the Sephardic legacy, but this is part of the Sephardic history, because the Sephardim were underground, and there were amazing things that they retained underground. Although after 500 years, most descendants who are Hispanic lost most of everything. But in the first, let's say, 2 centuries after the expulsion, you had phenomenal people who came out of hiding and returned very soon to the Torah world, because they had continued underground. Moving on. So the Jews are expelled in 1492. There was an expulsion decree. Most of the Jews couldn't leave. Some went to North Africa, some ended up in the Ottoman Empire. But the main story is 100,000 Jews were forced, they had no alternative but to go to Portugal. At the same time, the Jews were expelled from Sicily, because that's part of the called Castilian Kingdom. And then when the Jews are transferred to Portugal, in 1496, there was a bogus expulsion decree and a mass conversion. And then in 1506, there were riots again to make sure that the new Christians were devout, and it was a big bloodbath. The Inquisition in Portugal was later than in Spain. There was an Inquisition in Majorca that started in 1411, but the main Inquisition in Spain began in Toledo in 1483. But in Portugal, it began in 1536. Go on. So the main story is the Jews from Iberia find refuge in the Ottoman Empire. The Jews who came from Sicily, Apulia, and Calabria, so they were expelled also at that time and a little bit afterward. Then the Spanish emigres, mostly from Castilla and Aragon, they arrived in the Ottoman Empire and to the main places of Constantinople, which was the new capital, and Salonika. Just for the record, the original Ottoman capital was Bursa, then Edirne, then Constantinople, etc., etc. Today, Constantinople is Istanbul. Constantinople is the name of the Byzantine Empire. But so even in Ottoman, let's say in the Ottoman lexicon, in the Ottoman frame of reference, it was still called Constantinople. Go on. Constantinople was the capital, and the economic capital, and Salonika was the Sephardic cultural capital of the expulse. So in Salonika and also Istanbul, Adrianople, Bursa, etc., the Jews organized according to region of origin. So if you were from Sicilia or from Évora in Portugal or Castilla, the first generation had their synagogue was called, their congregation was called Kahal Kadosh Castilla Yashan. And then the second wave which came was Kahal Kadosh Castilla Hadash, the new one. And of course, there are tensions between the generations, but in Salonika was the most pronounced, this organizing by geographical origin. And eventually, they only became synagogues. Originally, they were entire Jewish communities, but within themselves. So if you were from Sicily, for example, you had your own yeshiva, you had your own printing press, you had your own treasury, your own fabric industry, but it became and plus your own schools, became too expensive. So the community amalgamated into one big Talmud Torah. But until the Holocaust, those communities of origins as synagogues still existed. Historically, people married within people from their own congregation. Families kept their legacy with other families that they traditionally married with, and they had the same professions. So it was either keeping the wealth in the family or keeping the traditions and professions together and marrying off their children within these frameworks. So what is the West in all of this? The Jews produced fabrics, silks, dyes, tans, leather, armaments, which they also brought from Spain. They learned how to make weapons from Spain, mining. They provided belts for the Sultan's elite forces, the Janissary fighters, and they developed the ports, loading, and then their specialty in Salonika was in the middle of the bay, they could load and unload with smaller boats. And that was a revolutionary idea at the time. Next. So the golden age of Salonika was the 16th, 17th century. You had luminaries like Yosef Karo, Joseph Taititzak, Shmuel de Medina, Yitzchak Kerem, Moshe de Boton, and there were many others. And then amongst the Sephardim, particularly in Holland, the Netherlands, you had the modern secularists who essentially were excommunicated, but that's the trend which they brought from them, which they cultivated, let's say, in Western Europe. I'm not so sure how much came from Spain itself, but so Spinoza, obviously, he's the founder of modernity and philosophy in general, and you had Oriol de Costa, and there are a few other heretics, and you've heard the name. Go on. So this is just one book of the de Botons from Salonika. It's a long lineage. There were other long lineages like the Gattegno family, like the Chavir family, etc., etc. Next. But these are traditional Spanish Jewish rabbinical families. One thing which is different between the Sephardim and Ashkenazim is the Sephardim have what's called Shitat HaYun, the Kompanton tradition from Zamora in the 15th century, where the emphasis is on the etymology of the word and not debating two different positions on a certain sugya, on a certain position. And that's a big difference. With time, within, let's say, after 2 centuries in the Ottoman Empire, that system broke down. The only ones in the Sephardic world who continue that system today are the Jews of Jerba, and they continue that system in Bnei Brak, the Mazuz family. So part of this rich cultural Eastern Sephardic culture, you've heard of Yisrael Najara, you've seen his Piyutim on Shabbat. Another one was Sadra Longo. Najara essentially made made the lyrics for hundreds of Piyutim based on popular Muslim songs of the time. So what do we have in common? We have the Muslim scales, the religious Muslim scales, that both the Jews, the Sephardic Jews, the Eastern Jews also, and the Muslims had. And that is something which is totally different than the Ashkenazim, and that exists till today. Obviously, the Holocaust wiped out a lot of that. The Holocaust also assimilation in the Americas, but in Israel you still have that. Especially Jews from Iraq have their own system of piyutim. Jews from Aleppo, for example, have a different system of slichot and bakashot and all sorts of things. But all this is based on the influences of Muslim traditions on Jewish ritual and Jewish religious culture. So in Amsterdam, you had modern poets already in the 17th century, Jacob Israel Belmonte, Moshe Pinto Delgado, and the famous Daniel Levy de Barrios. Go on. So again, I took this slide from other courses I taught, but here you have some names of the great rabbis. I didn't talk about everyone, but you had Rabbi Yaakov ibn Chabib, who wrote in Yaakov. That's a standard text in all yeshivot. And what a special thing you had in Salonika was Beit Midrash L'Zimra B'Shira. It was an academy for piyutim. Wherever you were in the Sephardic world, if you wanted your song, your liturgical song to be part of the prayer book, you had to work it out in Salonika. Najara's family was from Salonika, but he was in Damascus. He came to Salonika, and then he worked out his famous piyutim. And also, Altabek did the same thing, and that's where he worked out his L'chadidi. An amazing thing Lusitanos was a Portuguese crypto-Jew, a Marrano, who came out very late, and he's known for making treatises on the blood cycle. But very shortly after he came out from Iberia and Portugal, he started a yeshiva in Salonika, which is unthinkable. Go on. So, again, repeating a little bit what I said, this is what the Salonicans did, and these were their enterprises, and this is the Western influence. Also, the Sephardim were the pioneers in the printing presses in Istanbul and in Salonika, and originally in Italy, the end of the 15th century, then the beginning of the 16th century, and all this is part of Sephardic tradition. Go on. That's what Salonika looks like, or looked like, let's say, in the 1960s. I don't have a picture of the classical view where there were old city walls and the Jews lived below, but you see the port, and you see basically this is the west side of the city, and the Jews lived on the west side and on the east side. Go on. Now, the darker side, of course, of Ottoman life, and also in the Arab world, and of course in Muslim Spain, for example, the Sultan ordered the execution of Chief Rabbi Yuda Koval for underestimating the amount of fabric and quality that he had to pay for the whole community for a poll tax. In times of war, when the Ottomans were losing to Russia, they were pressed. The Jews were devout, but they had to provide all sorts of fabrics as like for tax. And if the Ottomans suspected them, then a chief rabbi would be executed. It also happened in Jerusalem. So there were special taxes that the Ottomans placed on the Jews. One thing I didn't talk about, in traditional Sephardic communal life, you had internal taxes. You had a system in the Ottoman Empire where the Jews had autonomy. They could practice their religion and maintain their own affairs. So, for example, they had a tax on meat, they had a tax on cheese, they had a tax on wine, and even the merchants had a tax on import-export. And all this went to the Jewish community. So, and then another negative thing was there was an imperial firman, an order, that Salonican Dayanim, the judges, rabbinical judges, had to issue a special tax to finance war against the Venetians in Crete. And then you had these janissaries. Everyone knows that the janissaries acted up against the Sultan in 1826, and there was a huge riot, and the Ottomans crushed them. There were no more janissaries. But the janissaries rioted, here you see, in 1669 against the Jews and other Muslims after the Ottomans lost in Crete, as if the Jews are the scapegoat. Now, the Jews were always devout to the throne from Spain and in the Ottoman Empire. They were always in the inner circle. They had a rivalry with the Armenians and the Greek Orthodox, but this was their strength. They had influence, but their influence was limited. Go on. So, now, the Jewish language in the Balkans is Judeo-Spanish. Also, the dialect in northern Morocco and Spanish Morocco is called Khafatiya. And then in the Arab and Muslim world, you had dialects of Judeo-Arabic from Morocco all the way to Iraq. So basically, not every country, but for example, Libya has a different Judeo-Arabic than Morocco, and which is different than Iraq. In Persia, you had Judeo-Persian, and then in Central Asia, you had all sorts of other special Jewish dialects. So now, the Jews of the Portuguese Jews, the Nación, basically was a concept of Portuguese merchants, not necessarily Jewish merchants, but it evolved into a whole network that united all the new Christians who came back to Judaism and were Jews practicing first in the Netherlands, first in Amsterdam, then in The Hague, Rotterdam, And then in England, the Jews had been expelled and they couldn't come back officially till like 1653. And then in the colonies in the New World. So the Portuguese Jews spoke Portuguese, Spanish, and then in the colonies, English and Dutch. So for example, the poor Jews in London were sent to the colonies. So that's how, for example, from the east end of London. So that's how Sephardim, for example, ended up in Savannah, Georgia. So you had Sephardic, specifically Portuguese communities all throughout the Caribbean. The largest was in Jamaica. Jamaica had like 16 different Portuguese Jewish communities and in different cities, different towns, and about 23 cemeteries. The biggest population in the Caribbean of the Jews was the Portuguese community in Curaçao. Eventually, it dwindled. In the Danish colonies, the biggest Jewish community was in St. Thomas. It was a port. It was a free port. There were no taxes. That's what attracted the Jews, and the Portuguese. So by this time, the Portuguese Jews are not. It's not an Eastern phenomenon. It's a Western phenomenon. But what was enriching was that the Portuguese, you know about the Tamim, the trucks. So Ashkenazim have a few, most Sephardim have about 3 or 4. The Portuguese Jews, until the Holocaust, had 14 different Tamim for different sets of, we'll call it reading. Let's say, there was a special set of Tamim, for example, to read Echa, and a separate set of Tamim for Haftarah and Torah, but that was, we don't know, we haven't explained it yet, but that is a phenomenon of the Western Sephardim. So I can't say that everything from the East is good and the West is bad, and the West is assimilating, but this was a positive thing, and it was wiped out by the Holocaust. And of course, assimilation in the Americas. And the Portuguese nation withered away through intermarriage, assimilation in the Caribbean, also because of the strong influence of the Reform movement. Now, there was a break in Sephardic tradition. When a community would leave Portugal or Spain, they would come out in organized groups, and the Sephardic world could bring them back to Judaism. But the last community in the last place that the phenomenon existed was in Copenhagen in about the 1820s. And then after that, the Sephardim lost, let's say, their active connection to all the Anusim and the crypto Jews. And so the tradition was cut, and then moving on, it's a whole history in itself, but the Sephardim bore the brunt of nationalism in the Balkans, and of course they were wiped out for the most part in the Holocaust. The Reform movement watered the Sephardim down, the Portuguese Jews in particular, in the Caribbean, but you have to ask the critical question, where was the Sephardic world? They had long abandoned these communities, and beforehand there was a rupture, we'll say, and of course the Holocaust was the total rupture. But beforehand, the communities were weakened. When the Ottoman Empire disbanded, you had a break in tradition, and that's the beginning of, we'll call it Turkification in Turkey, and in the interwar period in Greece, the Sephardic communities, in particular in Salonika, already decayed, and there was migration to the east, and there was anti-Semitism. But one amazing thing, it's negative of course, is that in Izmir, about a fourth of the community were Portuguese, and there was no Holocaust, and they just withered away. And when they left Turkey, because of a luxury tax in World War II, and then when the State of Israel was established, but also during migratory waves at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, those Portuguese Jews from Izmir didn't replicate. So, for example, when Jews left Izmir and they went to Buenos Aires, they replicated. They formed their own Sephardic community. Or in Seattle, they were part of co-organization of communities. But this large enclave of Portuguese Jews in Izmir totally disappeared, and there's no trace. In the archives in Jerusalem, for example, in the Central Archives of Jewish People, that we have dowry assessment in Judeo-Spanish Solitreo script, and it shows until the 40s that they still had this old system of estimating a dowry. Okay, and when these Jews went to Turkey or when they went to Latin America, they lost it all. They didn't organize as a community at all, and this is an interesting phenomenon. Okay, moving on. So you have Sabbatianism, the false messiah Shabtai Tzvi, that swept the Jewish world, but of course it started in Salonika and Izmir, and it spreads as far as Yemen, Persia, and Morocco. And then the 18th century, Sabbatianism took root with the Western Sephardim, and in Western Europe with Ashkenazim, and eventually in Poland and Eastern Europe, they become Frankism. Instead of converting to Islam, they converted to Christianity, and they're covert Sabbatians and all sorts of stuff, and all sorts of precarious sexual customs and lascivious behavior. But Chassidut, the Hasidim came from, many of them came from Sabbatian background. It's a whole different genre, let's say. It's a rebellion against the Eastern European Talmudic Lithuanians, and they were much more spiritual, but the original roots were Sabbatian. And what's interesting, the Hasidim took what they thought was an amalgamation of all the different Jewish liturgies. So they adopted what's called Nusach Sfard, not Sfaradi, and it's a combination of Ashkenazi and Sephardic tradition. And so the Hasidim have a different, they have a different tradition than Editor of Sefarad or Salonika or regular Ashkenazic German Nusach. Okay, go on. So the famous book for the layman of the commentaries of the Torah was Me'am Loez, which started in Salonika and continued in Yerushalayim, but it's a Salonican family. It was also written partially in Izmir. Each book of the Torah and Nevi'im were written in various places. But this is the classic Sephardic book. Originally, that's Ladino, and it's typeset in Rashi script, and it's hardly been analyzed in its original form. Go on. So, all this classical Sephardic culture is pre-Enlightenment. In other words, until then, it was thought of that everything was God-given and everything was religious, and if you deviated from that, like Spinoza or other rabbis in Amsterdam, which were accused of things like that, then you're leading to heresy. So once after the French Revolution, the Sephardim didn't have enlightenment in the classical sense that they had to become secular to get out of the ghetto. The Sephardim in the Ottoman Empire had rights, and they led educational trends, and they modernized, but they weren't enchained by Muslim society, as opposed to, let's say, Christian society in Poland and Ukraine and under the Tsars, et cetera, et cetera. But there were changes in the Ottoman Empire. You had democratic leaning reforms called the Tanzimat reform in the 19th century. There was a movement for constitutionalism, which in the end the Sultan nixed, but the Jews were involved in that in Salonika and other places, and they edited newspapers to further that. But at this point, in the Sephardic world and in the Ottoman Empire, the yeshiva structure is breaks down, rabbinical control breaks down, the societies become much more secular. Go on. Next. So this is like traditional Sephardic Salonican dress. In each city, women and men had different styles, but that's not how people dressed after World War I for the most part. Only older people. Go on. Now, modernization. Who are the Francos? The Francos are Portuguese, a combination of Portuguese and Sephardic Jews from Livorno, who were highly westernized. And when the city of Livorno lost its status as a free port because of Italian nationalism and regulation, the Francos went to all sorts of places in the Levant, in the east. They went to Salonika, they went to Aleppo, they went to Istanbul, and they advanced the Jewish communities. These people were affluent. They modernized the populations. They were a support system for synagogues and during catastrophes. And part of the whole wave was Western European education. Because of Sabbatianism, for like 150 years, 200 years, Sephardic Jewry was in darkness. And the Alliance Israelite Universelle from France was supposed to uplift the poor, slovenly Sephardim or even Ashkenazim of the East, and it was very problematic. It provided a good secular education according to the ideals of the French Revolution. It taught French. Immediately before that, there were Italian governmental schools. To get a good education, sometimes you go to the Catholic Frere or Sir schools. So the Alliance had positive drawbacks. It educated the local Jewish communities. It created a middle class, but it led to secularization. The teachers were very secular. It started in, let's say, the 1860s and went on until the beginning of the 20th century. And it was a clash in the end between Sephardic Jewry and the Alliance. And Judeo-Spanish is no longer the language in public, but it's at home. The Jews become Francicized. And then, but the positive spin-offs were that the Jews, they nourished a lot from the West. They started factories, they industrialized, and then in Salonika and other places, the Sephardim were pioneers in introducing the tram and the train and street lights and the steamships. And but the secularization really broke most of the rabbinic tradition. Go on. I can only talk about so much in the lecture, but so in the Ottoman Empire and in the, let's call it the Arabic domain, you had very active Jewish communities in Lebanon and Aleppo and Damascus. And as you may know, the Jews of Aleppo and Damascus evolved separately, and they're separate today. The Aleppo Jews are much more religious, much more scholarly in terms of Talmud. The Jews from Damascus were more secular into political Zionism. Under Shiism, the Jews in Iran had it very bad. There were many forced conversions. You've heard maybe about the Mashhadi Jews. There was a libel that the Jews were accused of killing a dog, and then they had to convert to Islam. Eventually, many they came back. But from, let's say, 1839 until the beginning of the 20th century, they were undercover. They were on the scene, and but the problems continued. But even under the Shah, or the Shah's father, in 1946, there were riots against the Jews of Mashhad. So Shiism is much more problematic, and many Jews actually, in the middle of the 19th century, converted from Judaism in Iran to Baha'i. And then in Central Asia, the Jews have a Persian linguistic base, but they're different. You had Mountain Jews, which is southern Russia today. You had You had the Jews of Uzbekistan, which the most well-known are Bukharan Jews. They mixed a little with Sephardim also there, and also in Jerusalem. And then you had the Jews in all the stans, in Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan. And these aren't Sephardic Jews, but their prayer rite is Mizrahi. Okay, now the West, in all these places too, especially in Lebanon and Damascus, you had assimilation. Even Aleppo Jews assimilated in the United States, and also in Argentina. In Argentina, they became conservative. In Aleppo, until the 60s, they really had waned. And with the hippies, they had a resurgence and return to a spiritual Judaism and eventually a religious Judaism. But so in the secularization from the Ottoman Empire, some of the positive spin-offs, let's say, were that it was Judeo-Spanish culture took off. So you had organized publishing of music, of romances. You had a vibrant Judeo-Spanish theater in Salonika and Istanbul. You had a Judeo-Spanish press, a daily press, weekly press. You had all throughout Turkey, you had satirical newspapers. You had an active Jewish press in French, and you had modern literature. Much of it was in translation. Much of the great works were translated, but it's a new phase of Jewish culture. Unfortunately, what tempered that in the end was the Holocaust, plus, let's say, the downfall of the Ottoman Empire, the creation of a modern Turkey, the Turkifications, because in modern Turkey, Jews could deal with Judeo-Spanish, but it had to be in private. You couldn't have any international association under Ataturk, and you couldn't have any, everything had to be Turkic. And then, of course, the language, the script changed. So from a Hebrew script in Istanbul and Turkey, Judeo-Spanish became Latinized. And that was part of the assimilation. That there's still Judeo-Spanish today in Latin characters, but it's much different, and it's a deviation from a strong-rooted culture. Go on. So, and then you also in North Africa had Judeo-Arabic theater, and in Iraq. These are one of the things that I want to reinvigorate in a Sephardic Mizrahi museum in Jerusalem. In the modern period, you had new forms of Judeo-Spanish music, particularly for holidays. They're called koplas, for Purim and Hanukkah. Music became much more institutionalized, and Iberian romances became performed in clubs, and all sorts of minstrels printed their own music little books. Today, University of California has many editions of these type of things. University of California Press. There were two famous composers, Sadiq and Gazoz from Salonika. There were about 4 noted ones. They died in Auschwitz, but essentially you could categorize them as modern Judeo-Spanish composers. There was a composer and a very active musicologist from Turkey who lived in Egypt called Alberto Khemsi. The Sephardim themselves didn't support him so much, but he laid a base for analyzing Sephardic music and keeping it going. And also from modernization, the Sephardim began to write history. So these are the original historians before the 80s, before people like me and Aaron Rodriguez and others entered the field, and now you have a new generation. But the original historians were Solomon Rozanas from Bulgaria, from Rufchuk, Judah Nechama, and then his son Joseph Nechama, he was the principal of 8 Alliance schools in the Alliance Israelite Universal Schools in Salonika. Abraham Galante from Turkey, Moshe David Gaon, who lived in Yerushalayim, but originally he was from Travnik, Yugoslavia, Moritz Halevi from Sarajevo, who was the head of the rabbinical college there, Avraham Danon from Edirne, Michael Mocho from Salonika, and one more, the last one. What did you, and Isaac Emanuel, who was a historian from Salonika, a rabbi, actually became a Reform rabbi in Cincinnati, and he was a rabbi during World War II in Curacao. One more, what's the last line? So, the traditional Jewish society spoke Judeo-Arabic and Judeo-Spanish. Judeo-Spanish was highly influenced by Ottoman Turkish, Greek, Bosnian, and also Aramaic and Hebrew. And then on the other hand, what's this westernization? We had the 1908 Young Turk Revolution. People were sick of the dictatorial sultan, and they wanted a more participatory democracy. The Jews were together with all the other ethnic and religious groups were part of the revolution. Of course, it went sour. There wasn't really freedom after that. But the big change was the revolution enabled ideology. So that's when Zionism was legal, socialism. A fourth of the Jewish community in Salonika were socialists. They were anti-Zionist. They were part of the Second Internationale, and they were very, very doctrinaire socialists. Most of them died in the Holocaust. And then another trend was Ottomanism, which believed in the Ottoman state. And then, like the Ashkenazim had Dubna, who believed you can be a Jew wherever you are, and you make the most of it, and you develop your culture there. You had that stream of local patriotism in Salonika and the Ottoman Empire. By the 19th century, all these main communities, Salonika, Istanbul, Edirne, and Izmir, become big economic, call them empire, port cities, not Edirne, but the other three. And then in the 19th century, after the cotton boom and the opening of the Suez Canal, Jews from Syria and Greece and Turkey, they settled in Egypt. They're the main part of the Egyptian Jewry, mostly Sephardic. The Jews in Alexandria were much more secular, and many came from parts of Greece like Corfu, Yanina, also Salonika. Istanbul, in Cairo, we had much more traditional Judaism, in particular the Aleppoan Jews. And but you know, in the continuum, when is there one more? Colonialism fell. Okay, Jews were not associated, for the most part, in North Africa, in the Middle East, with Arab nationalism. The Jews bore the brunt of colonialism. Some Jews, most Jews no, some Jews had jobs with the colonial powers in the administration. Obviously, many Jews became wealthy in commerce from colonialism. You know, from Baghdad, Jews like the Sassoons went to Bombay and then to Shanghai in the Far East. So they definitely benefited from colonialism. But most Jews were ordinary people, middle class, whatever. They had a lot of poor Jews. And for example, in Egypt, they were expelled finally in 1956. There were riots earlier, 1947. The background also is the end of colonialism, the beginning of Arab nationalism, the birth of the Jewish state. But as it looked like the Jewish state and Zionism took root, that's when the Arab nationalists throughout North Africa and the Middle East started to organize, and they became frustrated. The British, for example, didn't allow them to go fight in Palestine or in the 30s and the 40s. So they took their aggression out on local communities, like in Libya. So in Libya, you had riots in 1945, 48, and 67. In Egypt, you had the riots in like 45, 47, and all throughout the Arab world. And so in Egypt, the Jews were expelled. In Libya, they were expelled. In most places, they weren't expelled, but life became very difficult. So in Morocco, half the Jews went to France, half the Jews went to Israel. In Algeria, you had the Civil War, and it was very bloody. After that, after Algeria became independent in 1962, most Jews went to France. So the post-Ottoman Empire, this is the tragedy. It was inevitable, okay? But all the various Jewish Sephardic enclaves began to wither. So after the Ottoman Empire, Judeo-Spanish dwindled, also in the Greek period, also in Yugoslavia, Bosnia, Turkey, wherever. But what was retained, and we see this especially in Israel, was Sephardic religion, religious culture, ritual, piyutim, bakashot, slichot, romances, folklores, proverbs, biblical stories, popular songs. And then in the part of Westernization is Jews become national patriots in Greece, Turkey, Yugoslavia, also in the modern Turkish state. But the Jewish communal structure dissipates even before the Holocaust. What held the Jews together was the Ottoman Empire, and before that, a Muslim society in Spain and Iberia. So there, outside of Israel, there are quite a few Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews who won Nobel Prizes. Never happened in Israel. The political issues we can get to another time. And then Sephardic Jews, as Westernized people, excel as authors, media people, filmmakers, etc. And I'm not talking about it here, but the final damper, obviously, is the Holocaust. Coming to Israel, losing a lot of the culture from the Labor Party regime originally, and then in the Americas, assimilation and the plight of the Sephardim in North America, is that they were so small and they're all different and they couldn't unite. And part of their downfall was they didn't create schools, they didn't create day schools. Instead, they created the burial societies. And so today, you're having a lot of interest, but the tragedy is you have no communal, you have synagogues, but you don't have communal networks. You don't have solidarity. There's very little solidarity today between the Jews of the Sephardic diaspora and and Israel. And this is what is missing, because, in a global world, you're united by Zoom sometimes, but you're a small amount of people or individuals in an isolated place. And the secret in the sustenance of Sephardic life is communal. You have to have community, you have to have leadership, you have to have volunteerism. And all those are missing today. So that's the lecture, and you can ask questions.
First of all, I want to thank you so much, Professor Kerem. It's an amazing story that we have as Sephardi Jews. You made me wish that I was back in college so I could have you as a professor and go into more of this in detail. I could have spent so much time. I have so many questions, but others have asked, and I'd like to give them the opportunity to ask. They put them in chat, so I'll read them to you, and you can respond. I know you're on Israel time, and thank you so much for getting up at 2 a.m. to give this lecture to us. So I'm sure you're wiped out. So we'll try to make it quick here. Let me go through. The first one was from Professor Asher. Gosh, the name's cut off. I'm sorry. Mattathias, yes. He said Christianity had a profound deleterious impact on the course of Jewish history, more so taking current developments. By contrast, he cores the implacable blame of Jews for the crucifixion and orthodoxy since Constantine's edict. Do you agree? And wouldn't an ecumenical synod comparable to the Vatican Council to remove such big lie from the dogma advance bilateral and world relations?
I totally agree. I forgot to put sort of polemics with Christianity in the Ottoman Empire. I had it in the notes, but I didn't put it in the PowerPoint. I forgot. So I talked in the PowerPoint, in my notes, I was going to put in blood libels, all the tensions in the Ottoman Empire between the Jews and the Greek Orthodox. But you're absolutely right, of course. So that I forgot to put in. I mean, in my sprint in the middle of the night now, I forgot about it. But in terms of that is monumental. I talked about a little bit in the Ottoman Port, the rivalries between Jews and Armenians and Greek Orthodox, but that's cardinal because in Egypt and in Turkey and in Greece, the Jews suffered in the modern period blood libel. Classically, it's thought that the Jews opposed Greek nationalism, so therefore there were blood libels. The real issue is their it's a theological issue, and that was used against the Jews as part of the 2,000-year polemic. You and I know this, but for the audience here, that's like a new thing. And it's not just that Christians are anti-Semites. The Orthodox they're intense, okay? So they take a lot from Judaism, but there are things they're not going to give up. And you know this, the literature, especially for Easter, is very anti-Semitic, very agitational. They accuse Judas of betraying Christ and the Jews as Christ killers, and that hasn't changed in the liturgy. So the Sephardic Jewry was influenced by that, but in the total picture, that's not the main motif. Although in the Holocaust, the Asia Minor refugees came to Salonika in the population transfer in 1922, and they brought with them a whole tradition of blood libels from Asia Minor. And there were the Campbell riots in 1931 in Salonika, and then in the Holocaust, those refugees wouldn't rescue Jews in Salonika. There are only 2 families of Greek Orthodox in Salonika that actually harbored Jews out of the whole population of, let's say, 56,000.
Amazing. Next question from Basia. She is looking for history and how to access Spanish and Portuguese records available. Is there a place she can look for more information, specifically for the surname Isabel in the Iberian Peninsula? Are there resources or databases you can direct her to?
As a last thing, that's a tough one. I mean, they're the classical texts. There's my book on researching in Israel. Bider has a book on Portuguese genealogy. There's some books on North African Jewry, which is part of this population. There's a 4-volume book, I forgot his name, it's late, from Portugal on Portuguese Jewry and Portuguese names. But there is no compiled work. I've done a lot of reports for Portuguese citizenship since 2015. So of the names which are known, there are many more last names. And of course, Spanish names from the various kingdoms, whether it's Castilla, Leon, Aragon, etc., etc. You have many pre-expulsion Sephardic names. You have many new Christian names. You have many names that the Jews adopted. But as a last name, I don't know, but you can be in touch with me and we have to work on it. It's not, I can't give you an answer on one foot.
Basu will send you his email address when we do a follow-up. I know your time. Are you okay for another question or two?
Yeah, no problem. I actually got second wind, but I'm fainting a little, but no, I can go on. No problem.
Please, if there's any more questions, post them in the chat. In the meantime, I wanted to ask you a couple of questions. First of all, there were 6 million Jews slaughtered in the Holocaust. What percentage of those people were Sephardim? I understand Salonika was like 95% wiped out, and there were some Libyans that were marched to the concentration camps. What percentage of that 6 million did Sephardim make up?
Well, Sephardim in Paris, they came up with the number of 250,000 Judeo-Spanish speakers who died in Auschwitz and probably also Treblinka. That's a little exaggerated, but let's say maybe 200,000, maybe. The Jews, the Sephardim were a minority, okay? If the Nazis would have deported Jews in Morocco, the whole figure, the whole demographics, and the whole figures would change. Okay, that in the end that didn't happen. The Allies arrived, Vichy stayed in power, but there was no mass deportation of Moroccan Jews. Because then there would have probably been 200,000 Jews deported from there. They weren't deported from Algeria. Only a small amount were deported from Tunisia. So it's about that number. It's a minority of the minority. But what the twist here is that the Salonicans and Greek Jews were about a fourth of the labor force in Auschwitz, and they don't receive any recognition in whatever they did, whether it's heroism or victims or as experiment victims, and that's more problematic. So in the Holocaust, in the historiography, they're hardly there. Many people have written about it already, but it's like not part of the canon. It's not part of Holocaust education. It's not part of museums. So when the Greek Jews revolted in 2 crematorium in the Birkenau revolt, that's not there. It's not in Auschwitz. They don't want to put it in. When a Salonican Jew shot a tank shell at the Pawiak prison in Warsaw and busted open the prison and freed the Auschwitz prisoners, they don't want to change the narrative. The Pawiak Museum doesn't want to change the narrative. The Auschwitz Museum doesn't want to change the narrative. The Warsaw Ghetto Museum, which is being planned now, they may put it in. But that's more problematic. So we're talking about a minority and minority. In the total picture, the Jews, the non-Ashkenazi Jews, were victims of the Holocaust in 24 countries, including the Far East. In most countries in the Far East, mostly Baghdadi Jews were put in Japanese labor concentration camps, family camps. Many were killed as Jews per se, not only because they were British nationals, and that's not part of the Holocaust. But in the numbers, the Sephardim are very small. You know, so let's say 200,000 out of 6 million. But there's a story in every place, and people suffered, and there was heroism, there was resistance, and that's really shied away from. But what's more relevant today, half the Jewish people are Sephardic or Mizrahi, okay, and especially in Israel. So they just can't really relate to the whole story because they think it's an Ashkenazi phenomenon. It's a phenomenon for most of the Jewish world. I mean, in Argentina, during the Holocaust, let's say the Jews weren't affected, but in most of the world, they were, okay? And refugees came to many places. So the phenomenon is much larger, but I think it's more significant that major centers like in Sarajevo and Belgrade and in Monastir were wiped out, and in Salonika and all throughout Greece and in Vienna, there are smaller communities. But there's a Sephardic synagogue in Berlin that there was Portuguese Jewry in the Netherlands, mainly Amsterdam and Den Haag. They were annihilated for the most part. Also, the Portuguese community in Hamburg. But it's a small part of the story, but it's significant because it's relevant to many people. Like I told you, how that Portuguese tradition hardly exists anymore. It was wiped out by the Holocaust. You had a very strong community, and it's not the same anymore.
Thank you so much. We're unfortunately out of time. I want to respect your time that you committed to, and especially being up so early in the morning to speak to us and our group. One last quick question. Would it be okay to share your PowerPoint presentation?
Yeah, gladly so.
I'd love to delve into it deeper.
Go for it, yes. I'm more than happy for you to use it. If people want to subscribe.
Thank you so much, Professor. Your video just locked up. Are you still with us? Uh-oh, that might have been a sign. Well, thank you everybody for joining us. What a pleasure. I appreciate it. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to email us at sephardicu@gmail.com, or you can go to our Facebook group, send me a private message, and I'd be happy to put you in touch or try to answer any questions you have. Otherwise, have a great evening, Shavua Tov, and we'll see you next time.
שבוע טוב, לילה טוב.
Nice.
שבוע
שבוע
טוב,
טוב.
לילה טוב.
לילה טוב.
Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.